All right. So, welcome all of you. It's again an honor for us to be, spending the next few minutes with the young talent stars of India who already been awarded for your excellent work in your respective fields. Welcome once again. So, we go on to the first speaker of the day, Dr. M. Nivian, who will be talking on an innovative alternative for spherophakia. Dr. Nivian, please share your screen.
Thank you, ma'am. Very good afternoon to one and all. Yeah. Is my screen visible, ma'am?
Yes.
Yeah. So, respected teachers, senior ophthalmologists, my dear friends. So, I'm going to talk on a new innovation for aphakia management, the CMT Flex IOL. So, no financial interest in my presentation. So, I'm just going to show a small video clipping of a 360-degree subluxated lens, which was planned for lensectomy with a secondary IOL fixation. So, as any innovation starts off with the question why, that's how 2 years back the invention started for the CMT Flex IOL. So these are the existing secondary IOL techniques that are available: the scleral fixated technique with the suture, the 2-point, the 4-point fixations, and then came the glued IOL, which is to the test of time for almost 10 years, where you externalize the haptics and tuck it in the Chariots tunnel. And there are modifications of the technique, like the XNIC technique, where they externalize the haptic through the needle, and then the Emanase technique, where they externalize the haptic and then cauterize the tip so that it prevents it from falling back. But these are all modifications of the existing IOL that was there in the market and various techniques that were used. So I thought, why not design a new IOL for such a condition? So that is where the invention started. So as for any secondary IOL, the 0-180 degree is the most key thing. So it helps in the stability of the lens. So once we mark the 0-180 degrees, a 2 by 2.5 scleral partial thickness scleral flaps are fashioned using a crescent blade on either side. This is relatively an easy step for people who are doing cataract surgery. So you can see the partial thickness flap. And then 1.5 millimeters away from the limbus, a 23 gauge sclerostomy is made using a needle on both the ends. So in this particular case, because we have the lens, I'm using the same sclerostomy and using the needle to fixate the subluxated lens. And through the other sclerostomy, I'm using the 23 gauge cutter and performing the lensectomy. So once inside, going and clearing away a little bit of the vitreous that is there behind the lens and making a small puncture from posteriorly. And then with a combination of some suction and cutting, making sure we don't drop the lens inside, as we are surgeons know how difficult it is once you drop the lens inside. So relatively a soft nucleus. So I think it was easy to remove the entire thing in toto. And then go ahead with the core vitrectomy that was performed. So this is the new modified CMT Flex IOL. As you can see, it's a single piece hydrophilic lens design with a specialized T-shaped haptic. So that is where the T that comes out of the sclerostomy opens up, and then that prevents the lens from falling back inside. So there is no need for tucking or suturing. And it's a single piece lens, and it can easily be done through a normal 2.8 millimeter clear corneal incision. As you can see, that forceps that we are using is a specialized Pranav T-Flex forceps. It's got some broad tip so that it is easy to grasp the head or the neck of the T junction that comes out. So this prevents the chipping away of these lenses when you're trying to pull it. And the second important thing is, right now, we are not pulling it away. We are just injecting the lens. So the entire lens is injected, and we can make sure that the trailing haptic is placed at the section or over the iris. And then the T-shaped junction is brought outside, as you can see. So there'll be a slight pop of the T, and then it opens up. And that's almost the end of one side, because this open T is actually what prevents the lens from falling back inside. So this is just a small animation clip. It can be loaded in any normal IOL cartridge. The only trick is to make sure that the T comes out first, because then it makes it easier to grasp. So any of the cartridges can be used. So it is injected inside. You can either grasp the head, that is the most ideal thing, or the neck also, because it is a hydrophilic material. It is forgiving, and it actually easily comes out through the sclerostomy, and that's how it stays under the scleral flap. Moving on to the other side, using the handshake technique, these are the Nishi grasping forceps, which has got serrations. So we don't want any damage to the IOL when we're doing this maneuver. So you can see it has been transferred to the other hand, and the same is repeated on the other side. The only thing we might find is a small resistance when it comes to the sclerostomy. So you should be careful in not pulling it too hard. So as you can see, that's almost the end of the surgery. The IOL is in place. It is well centered. Yes, you don't have to titrate the amount of tucking or the haptics that you have to do. And right now we're just using glue to actually close the flaps and the conjunctiva, but sometimes you can suture it, or even that may not be needed. So this is the end of the surgery, and these are the few day one post-operative pictures. So the few mild edema, but you get well-centered and round pupil. And these are 1 month post-op pictures. As you can see, clear corneas, well-centered IOL. And our study also has the UBM pictures to just know the anatomical position of the lens and whether there's no rubbing of the lens when the iris constricts and dilates. And also the OCTs through the sclera to see how the haptics actually behave under the scleral bed. So we have some publications in our local journals of state chapters, and also recently it has been accepted in the JCROs also as a new and innovative lens design for the treatment for aphakia in any post-cataract surgeries. So thank you all for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nivyan, and once again, congratulations for the award, being the young talent of India. So we'll quickly go on to the next presentation by Dr. Rohit Modi. Jugadathon, Aka Medical Hackathon. Over to you, Dr. Rohit. You can share the screen, please.
Hi, is my screen visible?
Yes, very much. And you're audible.
Hello. Yeah, thank you. So today I'm going to speak on Jugadathon, aka Medical Hackathon. At the outset, I would like to thank AIOS, Maharashtra Ophthalmic Society, LVPI for inspiration, Makers Asylum, my teammates, patients, and my family. Well, we in India are known for Jugad, sometimes simple, sometimes complicated to make life easier. And many a times we do get such kind of ideas when we are operating or seeing patients in the clinic. But we are not able to execute it because of the lack of technical support. Now, Hackathon gives an opportunity to an ophthalmologist to become an innovator, to bring our ideas into real life. Now, for example, 6 to 7 years back, when I started my practice, there's a problem which I faced was anterior segment imaging to a cost-effective solution. That time, these kind of adapters which connect your smartphone to the slit lamp were not available freely in the market. And product designer. And the teams can work for 2 to 3 days during the time of the conference and then present a prototype. The best prototype can get a sponsorship to work for a year to develop into a product. And that's what we did. It was a team of biomedical engineer, me along with a product designer, which made this global slit lamp adapter, which even got the patent in India, and we sold it for quite a few years online. The next project, which was, original design was by Dr. Mukesh for a fund. He had used a PVC pipe, which was hard to replicate. It was redesigned with the help of a product designer and a biomedical engineer, and that design could be 3D printed. Again, a collaboration made a complicated PVC attachment simple in terms of 3D printing. Here we can see a peripheral retinal hole picked up by a fundus scanner. Another device which the whole team worked on was a smart angle imaging device during the annual Maharashtra Ophthalmic Society's conference when we had conducted the hackathon way back in 2018. And the focus was on glaucoma screening, especially angle closure glaucoma. Here a 4-mirror was attached to a smartphone and a magnifying lens was assembled in between. And you can see a simple assembly could give us images of the angle. Simple solutions for complicated problems. Another problem statement, what we looked at during the same conference, was that intravitreal injection guide, because intravitreal injections are now commonly given by the anterior segment surgeons. And we do get patients with lens touch or inadvertent perforation. And that's where this intravitreal guide system was designed and 3D printed within a day can be used. Another question which we always face in the clinic is the compliance by the kids for the amblyopia occlusion patching. Here a smartphone link time tracker device is attached to the spectacle and a pressure sensor is attached. So during the duration of wearing of the spectacles, the time tracker gets activated and the time for which these kind of spectacles for one can be recorded, and hence compliance can be measured. In conclusion, we can come up with cost-effective solutions. This gives us impetus to research, and research can be accessible to all residents, ophthalmologists, even those who are practicing in rural areas in these hackathons. And it helps our country grow in terms of research and development. We even published our concept in Kerala Journal of Ophthalmology. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rohit, for the excellent presentation as always, and the innovation behind this. So we are going on to the next presentation of the day by Dr. Shweta Gupta. Has she joined us?
Feroz, you are going to take the discussion at the end, is it?
Yes, if at all we have any discussion. Or Amit, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just wanted to pass a comment for the Rohit's hackathon thing.
Yeah.
We started, I think, hackathon in Indore first and a national conference, and it was a great hit. Lot of new innovations, Rohit, lot of new ideas, all budget-friendly innovations, which are going to help all the comprehensive ophthalmologists, a solo practitioner, to overcome all those expensive toys which they can't afford, or which which is not they can't afford, the break even can't be there. So these hackathons help an individual practitioner to come out with some jugaad by which they can be utilized for their day-to-day practice. And your hackathons have been useful. There have been a lot of innovations. You have published this in Kerala State Journal. I request you to go ahead with those hackathons. This year it was virtual, so we couldn't have a hackathon, but I request try to make hackathon a part of every conference, within the state conference, a 2-hour session, and try to publish all this in a peer-reviewed journal, and try to work with the AIOS to get the patents of few of those new innovations what you've come up with. Thanks a lot, Rohit. This is what I wanted to speak about, and you are excellent in your presentation. Feroz, over to you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Do we have Shweta on board? Not yet. Okay. So let's go to the next presenter in line, Dr. Soham Basak. Welcome, and over to you. You can share your screen right away. And Dr. Soham will be talking about air-assisted donor lenticule insertion in Descemet stripping endothelial keratoplasty in aphakia. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, dear seniors and colleagues. I'll be talking about air-assisted donor lenticle insertion in DSEC for aphakia management. I have no financial interest in this talk. So we all know that doing DSEC in aphakia is challenging because the air tends to go backwards and there is a risk of the donor lenticule dropping posteriorly. So surgeons have come up with multiple modifications in surgical techniques like various suture techniques and suture fixations and scaffold techniques, and sometimes suturing in the pupilloplasty to give some support. So here is my novel technique of doing an air-assisted DSEC in these aphakic eyes, especially with large iris defects. So the key point here is air is used to maintain anterior chamber during all the steps. There is no use of intracameral sodium hyaluronate. So all the steps, key steps like Descemet stripping, donor insertion take place with a pre-existing air bubble in the AC, so which gives minimum donor manipulation and no to minimal fluid air management. So here's a short video. So this is a young man with coloboma who had undergone previous vitrectomy and lensectomy and eventually developed aphakic bullous keratopathy. So we start off by removing the BSK which has developed. And there was some emulsified silicone oil also. So this is just a EDTA chelation of the BSK which improves the view. And we proceed making the sclerocorneal tunnel, a slightly larger tunnel than usual since we'll be inserting an unfolded donor graft here. So here is the Descemet stripping, which is done in the presence of an air bubble. So sometimes if there is escape of air, we just need to refill it periodically. But if the side ports are well planned and small enough, then the air usually does not slip out. There was a little bit of tension here where the stripped desmids almost fell posteriorly. And here it is being retrieved out. So DSEC graft is prepared manually. And then here's the needle insertion technique. So we coat the scleral incision generously with cohesive viscoelastic, and then it is with a 26 gauge needle, it is gently slided over the air bubble that is in the AC, so that it slides sort of in, it's always maintaining contact with the air fluid management, just inflated to achieve adequate tension. And this is the post-op of the same patient at 1 day and finally at 6 months. So then endothelial cell loss is slightly more because we are dragging the donor tissue over the sclera, but otherwise the surgical outcome is good. So this is the ASOCT of the same patient, showing how the graft has sort of become compact over the period of time. And this is the old data. I have done a few more since then, but I'll be presenting 7 eyes of 7 patients. So all of them improved, visual improvement was there. And fortunately, no incidence of graft dislocation or rebubbling. And specular, at that time, there was a lockdown was going on. So I had specular of only 2 patients. So slightly more cell loss than expected. So air-assisted technique appears to be safe and repeatable, at least in a short follow-up. So a longer follow-up will, of course, let us know how the graft survival goes on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Soham. Beautiful presentation. Soham, you had presented this last year, and that time you had a series of 7 cases. So have you increased your numbers now since that time?
I have 4. I have added 4 more, but I intentionally did not add those. I have not made edits.
No, that's okay. That's okay. You should not have. You should not do any edits. What has been selected. But what I wanted to know is, so now you have a series of 11 patients.
11 patients, yes.
So the results are comparable. I mean, what you had with the 7 patients.
Among these 4, I have encountered 1 episode of rejection so far, but the graft attachment and dislocation, fortunately, there has been.
Okay, so that is a good thing, but rejection, we need to take care of that. And have you published this?
No, not yet, not yet.
Not yet. So you're waiting for a larger series to be over.
No, I'm waiting for a longer follow-up actually. So 11 patients, I feel, is because aphakia with iris defect itself is a very small cohort. So I'm waiting for a little longer follow-up, then probably I can try and publish this.
Okay. Thank you, Soham. Fairuz, over to you.
Yeah, I just have a quick question, Soham, although I'm not an anterior segment surgeon. So what is the chance when you insert the lenticule, although you have the air, what is the chance of the air getting in between the donor, the graft and the cornea?
So the more likely what would happen is the air escaping out. So making the tunnel is the most important part here. So we need to make a wide tunnel. So in normally tachyfold, a little bit smaller tunnel is fine, but here you would need to make 5.5 to 6 millimeter tunnel.
Okay.
And the angulation of the needle should be such, it should be pointing little upwards, and then just slowly drag it across the host stroma, the posterior aspect of the host stroma.
Okay.
Can I make a comment, ma'am, once?
Sure. Go ahead.
So, I mean, I have almost very nil experience with this sort of work, being a posterior segment surgeon. But there was one instance when I had an aphakia and I had a full VR surgery going on, and there was a slight desmis stripping. So I think I did something similar because I'd seen your video. I just turned on the FG and the air came up, and it was a full chamber and everything, and I just repositioned it. I did very well.
So Soham, have you done another case after this presentation? Like how many do you have in your
series? So as I was talking to Dr. Amit, so now I have a series of 11 patients.
Okay, great. Yeah, all right. So can we go to the next presentation of the day? So may I invite, Dr. Veer Singh. Could you please share your slide? Go ahead,
Yeah,
Dr. Mir.
is my screen visible?
Yes, and you're audible.
So thank you, AIS Scientific Committee, once again for having me on this platform. I'm going to be basically talking about my mini PVD. Just one, yeah. So I'm going to be talking about my mini PVD technique and the use of a beveled cutter in challenging flat membrane PDR cases. I don't have any financial interest, but I have a disclosure that my video won a runner-up award at IRSI last year. So in diabetic TRD vitrectomies, the difficulty level all depends on the presence or absence of a PVD. In case a PVD is present, the membranes are lifted up and there's a very good dissection plane and the job is very easy. In case, on the other hand, there is no PVD or a very limited PVD, the membranes are banked flat and there is no plane, no space to work and the case is difficult. So in these flat membrane TRD cases, one always tries to look for a membrane edge, try to lift it up and get into the correct plane. Unfortunately, most of these cases are vitroschisis and you end up in the wrong plane. So I never search for a membrane edge. I go straight to the disc, lift up the prolif from the disc just by a millimeter or two. This gives me a small PVD around the disc in that green zone. Opening this PVD up gets me right in the correct plane under the second membrane. And then the job is very easy, just like a lifted up prolif. And so as a result, in this technique, there is no need to find a membrane edge. You always you create a membrane edge. Of course, with the 10K bevel cutter, the job becomes much safer and, you can work very close to the retina. I'm going to be showing two cases. Case one, this is a very fibrous prolif. I go straight to the disc. It's a flat membrane and lift it up. Now you'll be able to see with those arrows, the PVD extends only up till there. Again, temporally, the PVD extends only up till there. And I get a membrane edge temporally. And the rest of the job is done by the cutter. I engage the cutter and the membranes start coming into the cutter's mouth. In fact, that little suction in the cut mode helps to even extend these PVDs. And the membranes just come like as if the PVD is already present, when in fact you have induced this PVD and you've created this membrane edge. Similarly, nasally, most of these membranes are much more adherent than the temporal side. I do the same maneuver on this side, refresh that mini PVD edge, and then it becomes a simple case from a very complex case. And the rest of the job is very easily done by the cutter, extending that edge into the periphery and working on those membranes just with the cutter. When you will feel that you might need a bimanual method, but it really easily comes off, and that's the last part of the membrane. So this is the post-op at 8 weeks. The second case is a less fibrous case, more vascular. So I use the cutter to induce this mini PVD. This gush of blood that comes, that tells us that the PVD is already, that has occurred. So what I need to do is just extend the PVD till where I want it and not pull it too much. So once I have that, nasally just extending a little bit. And once I have that, the rest of the job is done by the cutting action. And with this 10K, you can work literally just so close to the retina and it won't cause any breaks. So you can just get in between those membranes and clean them up. Like I said, nasally, you have to refresh this mini PVD that you created. And then further, the rest of the job is done by the cutter, extending it into the periphery, temporally again, working along that same edge. And then just no need to go anywhere else, just use this edge and work circumferentially around the disc. And in fact, getting just under those membranes, just with that cutter, no other second instrument required after that PVD is created. Here you'll notice that there's a bleed. And with this beveled tip, it aligns so well to the contour of the retina that you can actually put mechanical pressure and stop it. No need to even raise the bottle height. And that's the last part of the membrane, which just comes off so easily. I'm finishing up with a ILM peeling endolaser. And these are some of the cases done by this technique. Even the most severest of cases can be managed without having the need to switch to bimanual surgery. So thank you. These are my references.
Thank you, Dr. Veer. Excellent surgery. Congratulate you on that. Amit, do you have any questions for Dr. Veer?
I'm not a retina specialist, but when I heard his talk in the talent search also, it was awesome. There were a lot of good feedbacks from the retina specialist. The thing which I would like for Veer is he's a great retina surgeon doing great surgical work. And the best part is he's an alumni of the same college where I belong to, my hometown, Belgaum. So that's what I can say, because my knowledge for retina is not much, the surgical retina, medical retina I do, but I'm sorry to comment on this.
So, Dr. Veer, is it a novel technique? Hello? Hello?
I think his internet has frozen. Yeah.
Okay, I thought I was frozen for a while.
No,
All right.
he's having some internet issues, I think.
All right. So shall we continue or we wait for him to come back? We have 1 minute with us.
We go ahead with the other presentation.
We go ahead with the other presentation. Okay. So 1 second. Swati had a login issue, Amit.
Yeah, I am in finally.
Yeah.
She's back. She's back.
Nice. Yeah. So I invite Dr. Swati Kalki, a very good friend and colleague of mine who does enormous work in ocular oncology. So she will be talking to us on ocular surface squamous neoplasia, a technique which is used. Over to you, Swati.
Thanks, Feroz, and good to see Dr. Amit and all others as well in this forum. So the next 4 minutes, I'll just talk to you about the concomitant SLET following excisional biopsy of ocular surface squamous neoplasia. I do not have any financial disclosures to make, and adequate consent has been obtained for the use of photographs in this presentation. Now, these are two cases where we can see that the patient has diffuse ocular surface squamous neoplasia, and both the patients had undergone a prior medical treatment which failed, and they came to us for further management. And the first one is back in the days when we were doing excisional biopsy in most of the cases. And the second case is in the interferon era where we tried interferon, but it was just not working. And then we went ahead with surgery. Now, in both the cases, we can see that the first case has developed total LSCD and the second case, a partial LSCD, that is the limbal stem cell deficiency. Now, in these cases, if we do a secondary SLET, let us see what happened. You can see that there is recurrence of the limbal stem cell deficiency in both the cases, the first and the second. Now, if we look at the reason why this has occurred, one, because the surgery itself induces the limbal stem cell loss, and second, there could have been underlying already stem cell deficiency that was present even before surgery. So how do we treat this condition? The only solution is that we replace the limbal stem cells, and we saw that when we did it as a secondary procedure, it really didn't work, but whether it can work if we do a primary SLET is something that we set out to study. Now, whenever we do excisional biopsy in these cases, we remove the tumor with good margins, 4 millimeters on the conjunctival side, 2 millimeters on the corneal side. And in the bargain, when the lesion is present at the limbus, we also lose the limbal stem cells. Now, we definitely replace the conjunctival and the corneal surface with an AMG, but we do not do anything for the limbal stem cells. So we thought of replacing them with by doing primary SLET. The next question was, which are the cases that actually require this additional procedure? So for this, we did a retrospective study and studied the previous cases of which patients actually developed limbal stem cell deficiency after surgery. And we saw that when the lesions were small, they did well with surgery without SLET. But when the lesions were larger, involving loss of more than 6 clock hours of limbal stem cells, almost all of them developed some form of limbal stem cell deficiency, some which had a visually significant LSCD, and some which did not affect the vision too much. So we thought of doing a primary SLET in these cases who would be undergoing surgery resulting resulting in a loss of more than 6 clock hours of limbal stem cells after the surgery for OSSN. The technique is as follows, where the usual technique of removal of the lesion with 4 millimeters margin on the conjunctival side and 2 millimeters margin on the nasal side, do a double freeze thaw cryo to the margins, apply AMG, and we take the limbal stem cells either from the same eye or the opposite eye, depending upon the number of clock hours of loss of the limbal stem cells. Then this tissue is cut into small bits and it is placed over the amniotic membrane graft, and these are secured in place by putting glue over them, and then a bandage contact lens. Now, this is a picture 1 week post-op where we can see that the SLET particles are there over the amniotic membrane graft. And these are the OCT images of how the SLET particles behave. So this is day 1. This is day 5, where we can see that the epithelium has started growing. On day 8, where the epithelium has grown between the 2 SLET particles. And by 3 months, the SLET particles almost completely dissolve, resulting in a normal, clear, crystal clear cornea. Now, here are some examples where we use this technique, and we can see that they had excellent results without any signs of limbal stem cell deficiency. And we published our initial series as well in 2016. So based on this study, we conclude that primary SLET after excision of OSSN involving more than 6 clock hours of limbal stem cells being lost during the surgical procedure, if we replace them with primary SLET, it prevents or at least minimizes the signs of limbal stem cell deficiency. Thank you very much for your kind attention and the opportunity as well.
Thank you, Dr. Swati. Excellent results. So I have just 2 questions for you, just as an open discussion. So you said that the secondary SLET outcomes were bad. Do you have a case series to account to the outcome here?
Yeah, so we initially, when we wanted to publish this, the initial thought process was how about we do a direct head-to-head comparison between primary SLET versus the secondary SLET. But when we started doing that, we had cases of secondary SLET, of course. We had, I think, 4 cases were there, and all of them had failed. But the tumor size was not comparable. And also, these patients who underwent secondary SLET had undergone many more procedures than, like, the primary SLET. So whether we can attribute the failure only to the secondary SLET or the prior treatments plus, they're going secondary SLET, that would be a difficult comparison. So because it was not a good comparable group, we did not do it as a direct comparative study at that time. But having said that, as I mentioned, we have a series of 4 cases where secondary SLET did not help. But of course, the confounding factor in them is that these patients are those who have undergone multiple other treatments as well before.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Swati. My second question for you. Most of the cases that I have seen there, they're quite large. So they might be associated with a scleral invasion, a deeper invasion in those cases. So after undergoing a primary SLET procedure in these patients, and we all follow up with a plaque brachytherapy for the surface, if at all there is invasion, when do you plan that?
Yeah, so in these cases, at least 2 of them had scleral extension, because as you can see, the cases that we selected are very, very large, and almost all of them had scleral fixity. So it is almost near impossible to attain a clear base in all cases, as all of us who operate on OSSN know that very well. So the cases when they have base involvement, we did it at 6 weeks itself. And sometimes the SLET particles are still in place. They're not completely absorbed, because usually the complete absorption, it occurs by about 8 weeks or beyond. So at 6 weeks, there are still traces of those SLET particles that were still there, but we still went ahead and did plaque radiotherapy, because taking care of the tumor is much more important. So we did at 6 weeks, and they did fine. One concern, of course, we had was, how would the radiation affect, will it worsen LSCT, or will it have any influence on the SLET particles? But because it was a small series, we did not, probably it's we cannot conclusively say that it will not have effect, but we did not see any effect, in spite of doing plaque radiotherapy. the SLED particles did well, and there was no LSCD in any of these cases.
Thank you so much, Swati. Thanks for the insight. All right.
Thank
We go on to the next presentation. I invite Dr. Shail Vasavada. Again, a very promising surgeon and a star in anterior segment surgeries in India, who has again won this award as the Young Talent of India. So Shail is again going to take us through toric IOLs in children, safety and outcomes. Over to you, Shail.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. We do receive research grant support from Alcon, but this study is not funded. Pediatric cataract surgery itself has an incidence of inducing astigmatism in the range of 1 to 3.5 diopters. Although the studies are limited, but they are limited even otherwise for pediatric cataract. And like all of us know that astigmatism is the most common cause or the most embryogenic of all the refractive errors that are present, including myopia and hypermetropia. So if we can somehow address this astigmatism, that should make quite a lot of sense. Now, children, the problem is the eye is growing, and therefore there are problems with IOL calculation. So what about the cornea? Literature does show that cornea stabilizes around 3 to 5 years of age. And after 5 years of age, the then next shift in the corneal astigmatism is reported only after 50 years of age. So we decided to evaluate the visual outcomes following toric IOL implantation in pediatric eyes with significant corneal astigmatism and who required cataract surgery. This was a prospective interventional case series where 76 eyes of 51 children with pre-existing astigmatism were included, all children above the age of 5 years. All needed to have regular astigmatism, and of course, all who would allow a good evaluation. So even if the patient is 7 years of age and they don't allow a good ocular examination like biometry, like keratometry or topography, we would not include them in the study. Standardized surgical technique was used and Acrisoft toric IOL was used, and follow-up was done up to 3 years, and a planned manual PCCC was done in children less than 10 years of age. No vitrectomy was planned unless there was a vitreous disturbance on table during the posterior capsulorhexis. And we studied not only the uncorrected and corrected visual acuity, but also a rotational stability of the IOL at 6 months using a software-based analysis, which we had published for the use of adults way back in 2009. So out of the 76 eyes, 61 eyes underwent PCCC, that is, they were less than 10 years, and about 15 eyes did not underwent PCCC because they were more than 10 years. Vitrectomy was required in about 10% of eyes where vitreous was disturbed during posterior capsulorhexis. No other intraoperative complications were noted. There was a significant improvement in the uncorrected distance visual acuity from preoperatively to postoperatively, as well as a significant improvement in the corrected distance visual acuity preoperatively and postoperatively. 5 eyes who had unilateral cataract had developed, probably had deep amblyopia, and there was no improvement in the corrected distance visual acuity. However, the uncorrected did improve, and 4 required YAG. The mean preoperative corneal astigmatism was 3.2 plus or minus 1.2. And at all follow-ups, there was a statistical improvement, significant improvement from preoperative to postoperative. And about 64% of eyes ended up in 0.5 to 1 diopter. And if we look at anything less than 1 diopter, it was almost close to 90% or plus, which is a quite acceptable outcome. Rotational stability at 6 months was compared using the software and photoslit images, and the mean rotation from baseline to 6 months was about 2 degrees, which is comparable to the rotation reported in adult population. And there was no difference in the eyes which had a posterior capsulorhexis or no posterior capsulorhexis as far as the rotational stability of the IOL goes. This is a representative picture of 2 years follow-up of a child. We do acknowledge Dr. Jagatram sir and his group have published a short, small series of 21 eyes of 17 children in which they've used toric IOLs with a shorter follow-up and no objective, evaluation of the rotational stability. We find in our study that toric IOL is effective in reducing astigmatism and therefore will help to reduce and combat the amblyopia. This at present happens to be one of the largest series with the longest follow-up, studying the rotational stability in pediatric population, and it was recently published in JCRS. Thank you so much for the patient listening.
Excellent presentation, Shell. I think Amit should take over this.
Excellent presentation, Shell. Shell, just few things I wanted to ask you. Once you have introduced GA to these pediatric patients, then what was the marking system that you have used for this patient? Was it a Virion system or was it manual marking? How did you proceed with that?
So this was manual marking freehand before they were taken up for GA. So all of these children were fairly cooperative because they allowed us to do biometry, they allowed us to do topography and things. So all of the markings were done pre-operatively outside, like we would do in adults, and we prefer generally even otherwise also freehand marking system. So yeah.
So no bubble marker, no slit lamp marking system, just a freehand marking system.
Yes.
Okay, and you had not used any image guided system for this?
No, not at that point of time. We did not have access because this had 3-year follow-up. So this was started way back in 2014-15. So at that time we had no access to image guide.
Did anti-vitrectomy affect your rotational stability?
No, it didn't. So even when we compared the posterior capsular axis group versus no posterior capsular axis group, there was no difference in the rotational stability.
Okay. So this was all Alcon lenses were used.
All single surgeon and a single kind of IOL, same brand IOL. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a problem. Most of these MNCs IOLs, standard IOLs which we are using, they have good rotational stability. But what I would like to point out is that especially the hydrophilic IOLs and some Indian hydrophobic toric IOLs, their rotational stability is not good even in adults. So we need to be very careful when we are going to tell about a take-home message kind of thing, that not all IOLs have good rotational stability. The IOL tackiness also does matter in helping with the rotational stability. So we need to evaluate that first before thinking of implanting IOL toric IOLs in the pediatric patients.
Absolutely,
so,
100%. Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah. That's what's from my side, Feiruz. Thank you. And Feiruz, just a small announcement. I want to leave this all because I got an IC to be presented. So you are going to take over from here.
Okay,
thank you.
No problem. Yeah. Bye. Thank you, Amit. Yeah. Excellent, Shell, and congratulations once again for being the Indian talent. We go on to the next speaker here. It's a pleasure to invite Dr. Swati Singh from LV Prasad. And she's known for her research in, lacrimal gland and also the lacrimal system. So today she's going to talk to us regarding a very simple and novel application of fluorescein ophthalmic strip in the lacrimal gland and salivary glands. Over to you, Swati.
Thank you, Dr. Feiruz. I'll share my screen.
Yes, please.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to take you through the innovations in dry eye diagnosis. Routinely, we examine the lacrimal gland and salivary glands in dry eye patients using Schirmer's test or TR meniscus height measurements or TR osmolarity. But there is a way where you can assess directly the lacrimal gland on slit lamp. So you ask the patient to look inferomedially, and this exposes the palpebral lobe of the gland in the temporal area. And here you can see a normal gland, which is seen as convex, having smooth shape with overlying conjunctival vessels. And if you look at the gland in patients who have dry eye, like Sjogren's syndrome, the contour has become flat and it's smaller in size and has increased vascularity, which indicates inflammation. And if you look at the glands in patients with dry eye due to cicatrizing disorders, you will see scarring directly over the conjunctiva overlying the gland. So we compared this between our 83 dry eye patients and 25 healthy subjects, and there was a significant differences in the morphometry, which can help in diagnosis of specific disorders like Sjogren's syndrome. Now, once you have seen the palpebral lobe, you just need to touch the fluorescent strip, a dry strip, onto the exposed area, and it will show you these secretory openings of the lacrimal gland. So you can easily count them, the number of ductules. You can calculate the tear flow per opening, and as well as how long it takes for the secretions to come up. Now we compare these parameters. If you look at the Sjogren's syndrome patient, here you can see panel A and C have no secretion, but in panel B, there's only one secretion remaining despite the normal size of the gland. And in Stevens-Johnson syndrome, here you can see that the arrow points out to the area which is bare of the scarring and still has an actively secreting ductule. So this helps in prognosis as well as diagnosis of patients with dry eye due to cicatrizing and autoimmune diseases. When we compare these parameters and these tests between normal patients, evaporative dry eye, and patients with aqueous deficiency dry eye, we found that there was a significant reduction in the number of ducts, the tear flow. Characteristically, there was an increased time lag in Sjogren patient. It took 3 seconds for the secretions to come up, as you can see in this panel. So this indicates that there is some form of neurological involvement happening in these glands, which is even delaying the secretomotor function. Now, minor salivary glands are relevant to us because to diagnose the patients who have Sjogren's syndrome or if you want to harvest a graft. So this is an easy technique to assess the lower lip salivary glands, where you just touch a moisture and fluorescence strip onto the vertical lower lip, and you see it under cobalt blue filter, and you can see these secretory openings, which are indicative of minor salivary glands in the lower lip. Now, this is a patient where we were suspecting Sjogren's syndrome, and in our OPD, when we did this test, you can easily see that their openings have reduced in the number. They may be like 12 or 14, and the area has significantly reduced. The secretory tear flow was significantly reduced. This was a patient who had severe dry eye disease and was referred for minor salivary gland transplantation. But when we did this test, there was no opening present. So we deferred the surgery. Now, once these glands have been transplanted into the eyes, we have surrogate measures like improvement in the Schirmer's or the fluorescence staining. There was no test existing till now where you can directly assess the activity. In a simple, easy way on your slit lamp, you can just touch the moisture and fluorescence strip over this exposed transplanted graft. And here you can see the secretory openings of salivary glands. Now, if you look at the case 2, clinically you can see that this palpebral lobe has vascularity, it's been taken up. But if you touch the fluorescence strip, there is no secretion coming out from this transplanted graft. So even if this patient has any amount of improvement, that is merely a placebo effect or because of the drops he's using. We have published our papers in the cornea and the ocular surface. And so fluorescent assistant is a very simple and cost-effective technique which can be used by every ophthalmologist in their clinics. And I thank LV Prasad Eye Institute and my dry eye team, Dr. Sayan, Dr. Swapna, and Dr. Pragna for their support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swati. And once again, congratulations for being the Indian talent for the research that you have done here. I have quick 2 questions for you, Dr. Swati. So has this become a mode of, screening or a technique in your OPD, which has replaced the other techniques of dry eye evaluation?
Okay, so to be honest, it will take long to replace it. It's not replacing them. It's definitely as an adjunctive modality. Like routinely you'll do Sharma's, but in cases where you are having, let's say, reduced values, in those cases, just to see if it's a Sjogren's syndrome, you can see at the size of the lobe as well as check the lower lip. And many times if secretions are reduced, even if their autoimmune panel comes negative like NTSSA or NTSSB, you can be sure of, okay, this is an autoimmune disease affecting the lacrimal and salivary glands. And another use which I have seen over months is that patients, many times these patients are using frequent lubricants. So they'll put eye drops in the waiting area, and when they come to the optometrist for workup and they put the strip, it'll show a false reading, let's say 7 mm or 10 mm. And if you look at the lacrimal gland and touch it, there's no secretion coming out. So you can cross-check and actually see that the patient has a severe dryness.
So Swati, you don't use it as a routine in your clinical practice whenever you have a severe dry eye patient?
No, like I use it not for the severe dry eye. Yes, you'll use it in severe dry eye, but not in evaporative dry eye where your Sharma's is more than 10. Then there's no need of examining the lacrimal gland with this fluorescence strip. But the patients where it is reduced, like a patient walks in your OPD who has Sharma's 6 and has no diagnosis of Sjogren's syndrome. So in those cases, this test is really helpful. The lacrimal.
Do you have a Schirmer's cutoff to use this as an adjuvant technique in your clinical practice?
Yes, I would do it for patients who have Sharma's less than 10.
All right. Okay. My second question, Dr. Swati, very interesting and curious. So you just mentioned about, checking the lacrimal gland in MGD patients. So what is the association, if you want to tell us?
So in meibomian gland is
Meibomian gland disease and, lacrimal gland. Yeah.
so mostly in those cases, their Sherman's values will be good. So if it's Sherman is coming 12 or 14, then you can be sure of, okay, gland is not involved. And it is going to show the values. What we found in our studies that the secretion flow rate as well as the number of ductules was similar to the normal. So the glands are not involved in meibomian gland dysfunction. So you'll do this test where you're suspecting a component of aqueous deficiency in the dry eye.
Correct. So
Yeah.
we know that MGD is a meibomian gland disorder, right? Like there is not much of an aqueous deficiency. There can be an association.
Yeah.
So how do you select the cases to do it for MGD? Like the application of this particular test in a patient of MGD, is it applicable?
Not much really.
Not much, right? Yeah. Okay. All right. Perfect.
And
Thank
another
you
use
so
is
much.
in
Yeah.
patients who have dacryodinitis. So recently I'm seeing many patients who will come with very swollen and inflamed glands, but if you touch the fluorescence strip, they'll have a very like increased amount of secretion. Actually, there'll be like 6-7 openings you can see and the secretions coming out. So many times we don't know if gland inflammation in dacryodinitis affects their secretory activities. Many studies do not report that. But if we directly can assess, even despite inflammation, there is a secretion which is happening. So
Okay.
that is one more test use which we are now doing in our clinics.
All right, perfect. And well, looking forward to more papers and more innovation from all of you. And once again, thank you so much for joining on behalf of the entire scientific team.
Thank you for asking
Great to
questions.
have you all with us. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So we are handing over the hall to the next session.